Katyusha, the Soviet rocket artillery that terrified the West. Introduction. When we think about weapons that defined the Second World War, tanks like the Soviet T-34 or the German Tiger often come to mind. Yet few weapons captured both the imagination and the fear of friend and foe alike as effectively as the Soviet Katyusha multiple rocket launcher. Known officially as the BM-13 and colloquially as Stalin's organ, this artillery system marked a revolutionary leap in battlefield firepower. The Katyusha's impact went far beyond its immediate tactical use. It had a profound psychological and strategic influence that shaped the perception of Soviet military capabilities in the West during and after the war. This essay explores how the Katyusha became one of the most feared weapons of World War II, why Western militaries took it so seriously, and how its legacy influenced Cold War doctrines and beyond. Origins of the Katyusha. Rocket artillery was not an entirely new idea in the early 20th century. Experiments with gunpowder-propelled projectiles date back to the 19th century, and several armies considered rockets for battlefield use. However, most of these systems were crude, inaccurate, and inferior to conventional artillery. In the late 1930s, Soviet engineers at the RNNII, Reactive Scientific Research Institute, developed a new series of solid-fuel rockets designated RS-82 and RS-132, originally intended for aircraft armament. Their effectiveness during the Winter War against Finland, 1939-1940, convinced Soviet commanders that ground-based launchers could unleash devastating firepower. By 1941, engineers mounted racks of these rockets onto trucks, initially the ZIS-6 6x4 vehicle, and the BM-13 Katyusha was born. The name Katyusha came from a popular Russian wartime song and quickly stuck among Soviet troops. First Blood, Barbarossa, and the Shock of Rocket Fire. The Katyusha made its combat debut in July 1941, during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. At the town of Orsha, a small battery of 7 Katyusha launchers unleashed a barrage on advancing German troops. The effect was catastrophic. Within seconds, a storm of 132mm rockets saturated German positions, destroying vehicles, tearing through infantry, and leaving survivors in shock. German reports describe the weapon as Stalin Orgel, Stalin's organ, because the launchers, with their multiple rails, resembled the pipes of a church organ, and the howling sound of the rockets produced a terrifying auditory effect. Unlike traditional artillery, which fired shells at a steady pace, the Katyusha delivered massive saturation fire within moments. A battery of launchers could unleash dozens of rockets in less than a minute, overwhelming defenders before they had time to seek cover. Tactical and psychological impact. 1. Volume of fire. The primary strength of the Katyusha was not pinpoint accuracy, but sheer saturation. A single launcher could fire up to 16 rockets in rapid succession, and batteries of 4 to 8 vehicles could devastate an entire grid square. While individual rockets were less accurate than artillery shells, the cumulative effect across a wide area compensated for this weakness. 2. Mobility and surprise. Mounted on trucks, Katyushas were far more mobile than conventional artillery. They could deliver their barrage and relocate within minutes, reducing vulnerability to counter-battery fire. This shoot-and-scoot tactic kept German forces guessing. 3. Psychological shock. Perhaps the most significant factor was the terror effect. Survivors of Katyusha strikes often recalled the shrieking sound of incoming rockets, followed by enormous explosions that shook the ground. Western observers later noted that the Katyusha was as much a weapon of psychological warfare as physical destruction. German troops came to dread the sound, associating it with sudden annihilation. 4. Force multiplier. The Soviet Union, especially in 1941-1942, faced shortages of heavy artillery and modern tanks. Katyushas provided a relatively inexpensive way to deliver massive firepower quickly, compensating for deficiencies in other areas. Western perceptions during the war. The Katyusha quickly attracted the attention of Allied observers. British and American officers who visited the Eastern Front reported on its effectiveness and the demoralizing effect it had on German troops. Western intelligence recognized that the Soviet Union had developed a battlefield weapon unlike anything in the German or Allied arsenal at the time. The United States and Britain experimented with their own versions of multiple rocket launchers during the war, such as the American T-34 Calliope, mounted on Sherman tanks, and the British Land Mattress. While effective in their own right, none achieved the same level of iconic status as the Katyusha. For the West, the Katyusha symbolized Soviet ingenuity, turning relatively simple rockets and trucks into a weapon that could alter the course of battle. It reinforced the image of the Soviet Union as a nation capable of producing practical, cost-effective, and devastatingly effective weapons under wartime pressure. The fear factor. Why the West took Katyusha seriously. 1. Disruption of German doctrine. German military strategy relied heavily on well-organized, fast-moving operations. Katyusha barrages disrupted these maneuvers, creating chaos in rear areas, destroying supply lines, and delaying offensives. Western analysts recognized that such firepower could counter blitzkrieg-style warfare, which had seemed unstoppable in 1941-41. 2. Symbol of Soviet massed firepower. The Katyusha embodied the Soviet philosophy of warfare, overwhelming the enemy with numbers and saturation rather than precision. Western planners feared that if such weapons were deployed at a massive scale in future conflicts, NATO forces could be quickly overwhelmed. 3. Psychological effect comparable to chemical weapons. While not as deadly as chemical weapons, Katyusha barrages created a psychological trauma similar in intensity. Soldiers who survived attacks often suffered lasting stress, a fact noted by Western medical officers studying the Eastern Front. 4. Ease of production and deployment. Perhaps most alarming for the West was that Katyushas were relatively inexpensive and simple to produce. Unlike heavy tanks or complex aircraft, a Katyusha could be mounted on any suitable truck chassis. This meant the Soviet Union could field them in massive numbers. Indeed, by the end of the war, tens of thousands had been deployed. Cold War legacy. After 1945, the Katyusha's influence extended into the Cold War. The Soviet Union continued developing new generations of multiple rocket launchers, such as the BM-21 Grad, which became one of the most widely used rocket artillery systems in the world. Western strategists took note. During the Korean War and later in Vietnam, both American and Allied forces faced rocket artillery inspired by the Katyusha. These systems maintained the same terrifying combination of mobility, saturation fire, and psychological impact. In NATO planning, Soviet rocket artillery became a central concern. Western analysts feared that in any large-scale European conflict, waves of rocket barrages could devastate defensive lines before armored spearheads broke through. The shadow of Katyusha thus influenced Western military doctrine, leading to investments in counter-battery radars, dispersed troop deployments, and rapid reaction air forces. Comparative analysis with Western weapons. When comparing Katyusha to Western artillery, several differences stand out. Accuracy. Western guns such as the US 105 howitzer were more accurate but lacked the same rapid saturation effect. Mobility. Katyusha trucks had greater shoot and scoot flexibility, though they were more vulnerable to enemy fire once spotted. Psychological impact. Western artillery created fear through precision strikes. Katyusha created panic through sheer volume. Production. The Soviet system was cheaper, easier to mass produce, and thus fielded in overwhelming numbers. These factors meant that, while technically inferior in some respects, the Katyusha achieved a greater strategic effect. Case studies of Western fear. 1. Operation Bagration, 1944. During the massive Soviet summer offensive, Katyusha barrages were employed on an unprecedented scale. Entire German divisions collapsed under the combined weight of rocket fire and armored assault. Western observers noted that the opening barrages were decisive in breaking through fortified lines. 2. Post-war NATO exercises. In the 1950s, NATO war games repeatedly simulated massed Soviet rocket artillery attacks. Reports emphasized that defending forces suffered catastrophic losses before armored counterattacks even began. The Katyusha effect was so feared that it influenced the development of nuclear artillery shells in the West as a means to counter Soviet saturation fire. Symbolism and propaganda. Beyond battlefield effectiveness, the Katyusha became a powerful symbol of Soviet might. Propaganda